dawn, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the forgeman he has been, and he's made the workers' state the best the world has ever seen.
الشمس ما حست بهاني فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه. فرشت نوره وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. وسمعناه بيقولها قوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
وسمعناه بيقولها قوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش فلاح الثورة
عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروى حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروى حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
قلبي وروحي ملك الفني والاتنين لبلادي هدية. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الفن رسالة عاش.
عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار فيها مداخن طالع منها لهب النور والنار. عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار فيها مداخن طالع منها لهب النور والنار. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية ده إنتاجي وصنع ايديا.
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية ده إنتاجي وصنع ايديا.
حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايض صدرناه. حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايض صدرناه. قولوا معايا حيوا معايا
عاش عاش العامل عاش.
عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار، يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار، يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجيل الصاعد عاش.
عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى بالقومية.
ثورة مارد للحرية هب
ردينا عليك يا جمال وايدينا في ايديك يا جمال وطلعنا معاك يا جمال نبني وياك يا جمال ردينا عليك يا جمال وايدينا في ايديك يا جمال وطلعنا معاك يا جمال نبني وياك يا جمال حيوا معايا قولوا معايا عاش عبد الناصر عاش
Стяг в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, реют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжается бой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весь летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы, будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И фронт продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome along. It is 22:44 on the evening of the 31st of January 2024. And of course, we continue to live in interesting times. Now, today and this evening, we are going to be talking about the latest from various different conflict zones in the world and be asking the question, are we already in World War III, or is that a thing to come? And are hopefully answering any confusion you might have on that, and talking a little bit more about questions of organization, etc., particularly in the imperialist countries. So before we go anywhere else and go any further, let us pause for a greetings of those who are in the chat. So Jay, good evening to you. Battle Cossack, who says, I hate alternative history channels. I used to watch them as a, don't know what word you meant there, iOS, and even use them as a source in high school. Of course, I got a free in an exam because of that. Also, they push neoliberal talking points. Yeah. Most history channels on YouTube, the big ones, are corporate funded junk. There's a Kings and Generals and shit like that. All those guys who run these alternate history channels, they're not very alternative. Basically, it's like history as delivered by Ben Shapiro, but perhaps with a slightly less annoying voice. Not worth the effort of even putting your eyes on them. YouTube history is like, if something blows up really big, there's a reason for it. There's a reason that something which is giving you an account of the origins of World War I, for instance, gets 161,000 views. It's not because usually that the history is particularly good. It's because it's being pushed. And that happens quite a lot. It happens with various different YouTubers who get big, and then the state, through some party or another, makes them an offer. I mean, the Grey Zone covered this with regard to, that guy who decided he was a woman, then decided to push the vaccine in Britain. BreadTube, that was it. Those BreadTube characters who were being courted by the British state to push their messaging. Same with anything else. When you consider that Britain or the United States or any other imperialist country is a bourgeois dictatorship, its security services and its police services and its culture industry are all seamlessly integrated. So they push products and particular channels, influencers, in many different platforms that are going to carry their messaging. So that they would do that with the big history channels is no surprise. So hello to Austin. Arjit8, I see what you did there with waves hello. Good evening to Roddy and Beju and Heidi, who says greetings from Edinburgh. And good evening to Gonzalo. Kent, hello to you. Good afternoon to you out there in Minneapolis. Marius, hello to you. And Martin and Morgan, good evening to you. My comrade Naylor, good evening to you. And Naylor correctly says glory to the resistance. And Munis, good evening. And C. Bolt, good evening. And That Day Will Come, who says great timing. And good evening to Roman Schiefer. And Older Larkin, who was previously known as Gerumpkin. Good evening to you. Marco, hello. And PM. Yeah, Naylor says BreadTube was pushed by the US Intel. Yeah, there was also a link up with, what's his name? That Fawn guy, Philosophy Tube, I think. I don't know whether he's English or not, but there was a link with the British Intel and influencing as well. I remember Max Blumenthal reporting on that. So BreadTube was being used by both sides of the evil empire. So Oz, hello. Hello to CJ out there in Richmond, Virginia. President Jesus, hello to you. And the article was BreadTube serves imperialism. Yes, that's correct. Was that the article, or was that Caleb Morpin's book on it? I can't remember which. But definitely the BreadTube were being influenced by the state, certainly. Certainly the American state. I think the British state as well. Okay, so we are running well, and so let's get to the items at hand. First of all, a question of terms. So a lot of stuff going around saying, are we in World War III? And the answer is, we'll only know once the history books are written. And by that, I don't just mean to give a flippant response to that inquiry. It's the case now that in the official histories of World War II in China, they're starting to write about it, or perhaps they have been for a while. I'm not familiar when they started doing this. They now date the beginning of World War II to 1931, which is the Japanese imperialists' invasion of Manchuria. And so for the Chinese, of course, what became known as World War II did indeed start in 1931. So if you're looking to find a starting point for World War III, that will only be decided in the future. I mean, potential starting points, well, how far back do you want to go? Do you want to say that World War III actually started in with the breakup of Yugoslavia? You could make a plausible case for that. Or perhaps a more plausible case would be 2001 and the American imperialists' invasion of and occupation of Afghanistan. Or let's go back 2 years before that. Could it be the Kosovo War? Or could it be the invasion and occupation of Iraq? Or perhaps a more plausible date, if you're looking for conflict between the great powers, would be the 2015 Russian intervention against the American regime change operation in Syria. Now, I know that the Russian intervention was against ISIS and Al-Qaeda under their different brand names, but in reality it was to preserve the Syrian government against an American regime change operation that was being run in a similar way to the Libyan operation. So you could argue for that. Oz agrees with that point in the chat, thinks that it was Syria in 2015. Marius says it was Obama's pivot to Asia in 2011 to 2012. That's conceivable. I mean, you could date the origins of this if we're going to try and pin it down with of course, the gigantic crisis of overproduction, which generated the crisis of the imperialist economy in 2008 to 2010, which of course necessitates from the point of view of imperialism, an increase in aggression towards both Russia and China, because we're in the middle of when we were in the middle of the financial crisis of 2008. That's when the Georgian War happened, and that was resolved relatively quickly. But shortly after that, of course, you get the American imperialists moving into action in Libya and in Syria, and you get the final realization also in Ukraine in 2014, and that sort of triggers the final realization inside the Russian government that there's no deal to be made here. There is just simply no negotiating with these people. So you could say it was back then. You could say that it began properly on the end of February in 2022 with the launch of the Russian special military operation. So there's a variety of dates that are available. So what I would say is leave the exact dating of this to the histories that will be written after it is over. Because, I mean, there's still, as we've just seen, an active debate over when World War II started. I mean, you could even dispute when World War I started. You could say that it actually started with the Balkan Wars, the multiple Balkan Wars that were waged between the beginning of the 20th century right up to 1913. You could even say that a precursor to it was the Russo-Japanese War, or even the scramble for China that was manifested partly in the brutal suppression of what's called in the West the Boxer Rebellion. And you could say that that was a sign of things to come. You could also argue that the period of World War I began with the decisive move of Britain, France, Germany, especially those three, also Italy to a lesser extent, and Russia, Tsarist Russia to a lesser extent, into the imperialist phase of capitalist development. You could say it began with the scramble for Africa. Again, the reason why I'm throwing all this out there is because you can make plausible arguments for all of those as to the date of World War One, and you could link together several different conflicts. With World War Two, you could say 1931, Japanese invasion of Manchuria. You could say remilitarization of the Rhineland just after the Nazis come to power, and the fact that the British and the French don't do anything to enforce the Versailles Treaty, as for reasons we've covered many times before, related to their profound wish that the Nazis turned east. And you could also say it began with the uncontested Nazi Anschluss, the unification with Austria, or the taking of the Sudetenland. Again, plenty of candidates for when that started, or Mussolini's invasion of Abyssinia, perhaps, if you wanted to look at that. So again, plenty of candidate dates for that, for both the previous world wars. Again, don't get too caught up in the constant memeing, because there's a lot of people who run far bigger channels than this one who will say OMG World WW3 basically every single day, and they'll tell you that the atomic clock, the doomsday clock run by the International Institute of Atomic Scientists, I think it is, these hysterical petty bourgeois types who keep putting it at 1 minute to midnight in the belief that that will somehow magically do something. Well, the way in which that I would respond to that is to say, whenever confronted with all of these hysterical headlines, take a step back and analyze the situation. Don't get caught up with what I'm going to call, I'll give it its technical term, internet bullshit. Because again, the time to judge when a certain war started, particularly if it's a global, or it's judged to be a global conflagration, is way afterwards. Let the historians deal with that 10, 20, 30, 40, 100 years down the line. So it's a question of really analyzing the situation and judging, okay, well, what would qualify this as a world war? So what qualified September 1914 as the outbreak of a world war, given that it wasn't one when it began necessarily, though it became one quite rapidly because of the involvement of globe-spanning imperialist powers. So the events of summer of 1914 took a regional Slav-wide or Yugoslav-wide Balkan crisis triggered by the assassination of the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, and turned it into a world war because, of course, everything was feeding into a pre-existing system of very acute and unresolvable contradictions. The contradictions that existed between the imperialist powers could not, by the summer of 1914, be resolved by another grand negotiation in London, Paris, or Berlin. Particularly those that existed between British and German imperialism. They could only be resolved through violence, through the annihilation of men, principally, but also the annihilation of gigantic amounts of capital, because you had, again, a gigantic crisis of overproduction. You had a crisis of imperialism that stemmed from that crisis of overproduction. In Britain, you have a crisis of profitability that generated the vast expansion of the British Empire through the scramble for Africa, and of course the move of German capitalism into its imperialist phase, and the German capitalists desperately desiring more colonial acquisitions to, of course, generate higher rates of profit from. So that's the root of this, and then within that, flowing from that, I should say, you have then all the other crises swirling around that. So the crisis of Austro-Hungarian legitimacy, given the monarchy and in that multinational empire that was sort of semi-capitalist, had some tendencies towards a sort of very small scale imperialism, but also had large elements of feudal production still in place within it. Their crisis that they were trying to resolve through aggressive expansion into the Balkans, but of course it was a very weak state, and it revealed the fact that it was a very weak state by essentially imploding under the pressure of war. You have, of course, the crisis that Lenin and Stalin write about in the Russian Empire, in the Tsarist Empire, resulting from the weakness of the Russian capitalist class, but in terms of their ability to remove the Tsardom, but the fact that they had moved into an aggressive imperialist phase and were looking hungrily to dismember both the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, to seize territory in the east of Europe, which is why that is the Russian bourgeois, as expressed through like the Cadet Party and the Octoberists in the Russian Duma at the time, were much more keen on the war in alliance with the militarist clique than even the Tsar himself was. So you've got all of these contradictions built up inside all these different imperialist states, and the principal one, I would argue, was between Britain as the now decaying imperialist power and Germany as the rising imperialist power, with the United States also in the mix as well, as an imperialist power that would find itself increasingly at the center of the imperialist system after 1918. So, what comparisons can we make now? Just to go further with this historical analysis and apply it to our own times. What is the essence of this particular series of crises that we find ourselves in? Well, if you want to take it all the way back, you could argue that we are still in the phase of the crisis of imperialism and war, revolution and counter-revolution, that the kickoff of the first great imperialist war in 1914 triggered what was now over 110 years, or almost 110 years, of war, revolution and counter-revolution. Began in 1914 and has flowed relentlessly around the world ever since. And if you take a truly global perspective about this, then that does make a lot of sense. Because let's think about it. The crisis of imperialism, particularly the crisis of British imperialism versus German imperialism, reaches a point of no return in the summer of 1914. However, the war doesn't truly resolve those issues. It partially resolves them by essentially the near destruction of German imperialism via war and the political crisis in German imperialism that it ushered in, the unfinished and crushed German Revolution, and the onerous terms of the peace put in place by France and Britain in particular, and then the onerous debts that the British and the French imperialists had taken out in the form of loans from American imperialism. So again, this doesn't resolve anything. The Russian Revolution resolves certain things inside the territories of what was to become the Soviet Union, but of course this also creates the century to come of revolution and counter-revolution, both inside the Soviet Union itself and the anti-colonial revolutions that swirl around the world and are triggered by it. It's not a coincidence, of course, that when the Ansar Allah delegation visited Moscow last week, that one of them took the time to go and visit Lenin's tomb, crediting Lenin with being the man whose legacy kicked off the anti-colonial revolution, which is, of course, entirely true. It's why Lenin is despised by the imperialists to this day, or one of the reasons anyway. So the century of revolution and counter-revolution, of course, continues with the long fight of the Communist Party of China that culminates, of course, in 1949, but ran all the way from the early 1920s. So essentially over a quarter of a century of revolutionary developments in China, which saw the Communist Party of China move forward, get set back in a brutal and bloody fashion, and ultimately triumph. So you look at that, and you look at the fact that it took a quarter of a century for the Communist Party of China to actually carry through the revolution and chase Chiang Kai-shek and his imperialist allies out of mainland China. And you can see and start to appreciate that historical processes take indeed a very long time. And to quote Chu Enlai himself, it's too early to tell, when he was, of course, asked about the impact of the French Revolution. When you are asked about, well, what is the verdict on the Chinese Revolution, it's still too early to tell, but generally speaking, the signs are still positive. So, again, the full verdict on the Russian Revolution can't be written yet, because I think we can say now, and this is I think most of you on this stream would agree. Perhaps if you don't, drop a comment in and we'll discuss it. That the Russian Revolution and the Russian revolutionary process was interrupted by various different things. Khrushchev's counter-revolutionary moves in 1956, which were then sort of stalled slightly, but then returned in new and deadlier form with Gorbachev. But the Russian Revolution, in terms of its legacies, is still there. I've said this many times before, but for all that Putin likes to periodically make reference to Tsardom and the legacy of the Tsarist state, the state that he runs has much, much more in common with the legacies of the Soviet state that preceded it than it even does by now with the Yeltsin state. I mean, yes, it's still the Yeltsin constitution, but if you look at the legacies in Russia, where on many different levels, with regard to how education is treated, with regard to the strong cultural legacies that the Russian Revolution and the Soviet Union left, the nationality policy. I've said this over and over again, but for all that Putin talks about, recalling the greatness of the Tsardom and damning Lenin and then his nationality policy and the Bolshevik nationality policy, he's inherited it. The way he talks about the Russian nation being a nation of many different peoples, but they're all Russian. And if you look at like the level of devolution that the various Russian regions have, the still existing protections for minority religions and languages that exist inside the Russian Federation, all of that doesn't come from the Tsardom. The Tsardom was into Russification. Putin has inherited the old Soviet system of nationalities, and he's just reconfigured that. Rather than talking about Soviet brotherhood and socialism, he's now just basically changed the language and called it Russian brotherhood. So again, and as Marius points out in the chat, Putin himself is basically a Brezhnevite cadre. That's essentially who he is. That's what he was trained as. That's where he came up. So, like, for all that he will denounce periodically, though less so, much less so these days, the Soviet system and the Soviet nationality policy, he exists within its framework still to this day. He is a creation of it. He talks about it less favorably than someone like Lukashenko, who really is. If you read biographies of Lukashenko, even his enemies will admit that he's a very pure product of the Soviet system. He is very much a Soviet man. I think Putin is as well, to be honest. And so I think it's a fair argument to make that the legacy of the Russian Revolution was a lot stronger than many of us on who were part of the Western left at some point thought it was, especially those of us who were in like dodgy Maoist or Trotskyite organizations. So, and as Oz points out in the chat, if it wasn't for the Soviet system, particularly the Soviet industrial system, then the special military operation wouldn't be successful. But also the Soviet patriotism, to follow on from last night's discussion, that was clearly so strongly felt in the Donbass, in Donetsk and Lugansk to this day, and the legacies of the Soviet system that existed there, and the working class who rebelled against the fascist coup in 2014, who wanted to defend that. that all comes from the Soviet system. Yes, there were people like Strelkov who went over there from Russia, who's a sort of czarist cosplayer, but the motivations of those early leaders in the rebellion, it was all much more about defending the Soviet legacy. Yes, that's mixed up with the fact that many of them are ethnic Russians. They're certainly Russian speakers. Many of them, of course, saw the Kiev regime as the return of aggressive banderism. But I think if you look at the way in which that early rebellion occurred, it was very much a rebellion of old-fashioned Soviet patriotism that's been attached to the modern Russian Federation. So regardless of whatever Putin intended, he's now inheriting more and more of the Soviet tradition as time goes by. Incidentally, there's a guy called Alexander Galushka. I've posted about him before in the Telegram chat. And he wrote the book called Crystal Growth, which is looking to, he's lobbying the Russian government to learn from the examples of the 5-year plans from 1929 to 1955. And he's had several meetings with Putin. He's run in the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. He ran a meeting in the Kremlin, with Kremlin officials, and also the heads of some of the new republics. For instance, Denis Pushilin was there from Donetsk, and several top Kremlin officials were there. And as part of his work, Galushka is apparently has designed an updated economic planning system, which he claims, and I don't know this to be accurate yet, this is just what he writes, to be able to implement modern technology in the form of assistance from what's called AI and modern economic and logistics planning systems. And he's saying that he's incorporated that into this new essentially IT-based economic planning system, which he seems to be lobbying Putin and the Russian government to put in place. So again, the return of at least a semi-planned economy in Russia, built on, of course, the gigantic industrial legacy of the Soviet Union. Again, without that, there's no SMO, and there would have been no SMO because without the Soviet legacy, there's no residual Soviet patriotism that motivates those workers in Donbass to carry out their rebellion in 2014 and to hold out for 8 years until the SMO began. So again, like this is a case of not being able to escape the legacy, and it's also why so many of the Russian oligarchs and their liberal acolytes have all fled or gone into a perpetual sulk. The Soviet legacy keeps reappearing and hasn't gone away, and so therefore I think we're fairly safe to conclude that the story of the Russian Revolution isn't over. It was interrupted by a counter-revolutionary process kicked off by Khrushchev and brought to its horrible conclusion by Gorbachev and Yeltsin, but its legacy has proven too strong, both within the industrial legacy that it built, but also, much more importantly, within the Russian and wider former Soviet working class themselves. And so this, I think, makes for probably a more interesting and lengthy discussion at a later date, but I think it's worth making the point at this stage. So to return to the historical side of things, the long-term unfolding of the crisis of imperialism post-1914, post-1918, and then post-1945 brings us to this point. We're still living with the legacies, the unfolding legacies of the Russian Revolution, the unfolding legacies of the Chinese Revolution, and the long-term decay, certainly of British imperialism. It's important to emphasize that British capitalism, in the 1840s to early 1850s, before it started being outstripped by its former rebellious colony, in the 1840s there was no one who could really compete with British manufacturing. The Americans were getting close and were gaining all the time. The Germans were starting to do things, but they were still not united into one country yet. But by 1855, I think it's fair to say, and this was discussed with Comrade Marius on the second episode we did, the American production of means of production had begun to out-innovate Britain in terms of its ability to produce efficient production line technology. And there's arguments made by scholars of British industrial development that the actual point of British industrial decline is definitively identifiable after 1860, but that some argue it was there as a result, observable as a result of being outstripped by the United States after about 1850. And that the imperialist period really starts then, because the British capitalist class stops investing in their own country and sends the capital overseas. And this crisis has taken an awful long time to fully play itself out, because Britain was so far ahead for a hell of a long time, and they've exploited and grabbed up an awful lot of capital via their exploitation of what was once British India, all of the colonies in Africa, Malaysia, places like that. And to be so far ahead and to be established as this global center of financial capitalism takes a long time for the wheels to finally come off that. But here we are. And so the crisis for British imperialism, which took, let's say 1860s our starting point, and let's argue it that way, it took 54 years to fully manifest in a war. That is, the contradictions between the decaying former manufacturing center of the world and one of the rising rivals in the form of the Germans. And it took 54 years, 1860 to 1914, for that to fully manifest itself. It takes another century, or roughly a century, for the decline of British imperialism to become incredibly obvious. So after 1956, it was clear that Britain as a land empire was finished, and also that it would have to ride along in the slipstream of the United States. But again, the illusion of British power, no, the illusions are the wrong word. The belief in British power, because it was still based on a real thing, as Norfield outlines. It's based on the fact that their financial center was still incredibly powerful. They could still field a decent-sized navy and air force during the Cold War. They still had nuclear weapons, albeit ones that the Americans ultimately had the trigger for. But the decline and feebleness of British imperialism really starts to show during their failed occupation of Afghanistan and Iraq as the junior partner to the United States. The fact that they couldn't mobilize an army due to domestic opposition to invade places like Libya and Syria. They didn't dare do it. They had to employ jihadist mercenaries to do it. And now it's fully revealed before everybody, because of course they can't fight Russia. They can't fight China. They couldn't even really fight the Netherlands, I don't think, if they actually tried to mobilize for it. So this is, again, like, takes a long time for an imperialist power that was that far ahead for that long in many different fields to fully fall. When you're the first capitalist power and the longest continually existing imperialist power, your fall takes a long time. There's a lot of residual energy there to dissipate. But now it's obvious. And then you get the other crisis, which is, of course, the long-term crisis of American imperialism. So this is, again, a long-term crisis which begins, I would argue, 64 to 65. And that's based on the analysis of people like Michael Roberts and Andrew Kleiman, and also some of the details that's in Hudson's book, Super Imperialism. Again, I will emphasize, I do not agree with Hudson's thesis at all. I find some of his speculations to be completely wild, but the historical recording in there is quite useful in terms of how a declining rate of profit combined with massive expenditure on the Vietnam War, the having to collapse the gold standard, having to go to a system whereby essentially the United States runs the global reserve currency. All of this ultimately proved to be serving as long-term weaknesses within American imperialism that reached the point where the crisis was emerging in the 1980s, arguably, saved by the counter-revolution in Eastern Europe and the USSR. But the contradictions just continued to get worse into the 90s, and until you get, of course, the gigantic crisis of 2008, which really isn't that long after the counter-revolution in the USSR and Eastern Europe. Now you've got the full scope of that crisis has become obvious because the US manufacturing sector, particularly its much vaunted military-industrial complex, is completely crap. It can't manufacture at the same level as the Russians, and certainly not in military affairs, can't manufacture at the same rate as the Chinese, can't compete, and no matter how much money they throw at it, the money just disappears and very, very unimpressive results arise. Hence why you have the crisis in Ukraine. So this sort of speculative ride we've been on here, what I have aimed to demonstrate is that if you really wanted to make an argument about what's been going on, we're at probably moving towards the end point of the 110-year-long manifestation of the crisis of imperialism. Now, this isn't particularly unique in historical terms. Remember, England and France had a 100 Years' War. There's various different things that have been called, for instance, the 30 Years' War, etc. Various other conflicts in other parts of the world have lasted decades and decades. So the crisis of imperialism that begins in 1914 would last over 100 years, I don't think is really too surprising when you consider the power that that system built up going up to 1914 and all of the power that it continued to hold even as the contradictions mounted, that it would take a century to fully unwind itself with all the twists and turns that were taken into the forms of revolutions and counter-revolutions. I don't think that's too far-fetched. So the conclusion of the argument that I've reached here is that really we are at the end of a century-long crisis in reality. It's just this is the latest manifestation of it. The crisis of imperialism, the doom of imperialism, cannot be escaped. But I'll just conclude this particular point by saying that when it comes to stuff like, oh my God, World War, OMG, WW free videos and various different associated memes, again, don't get sucked into like councils of despair. Look, the capacity to stop or to at least exploit the crisis caused by the decay of imperialism is still there within the capacity of the American or the British or the French proletariat to deliver. You already see these countries in Europe becoming increasingly destabilized by farmers' protests, by industrial action, by even like amorphous, incoherent populist movements like the Yellow Vest movement in France. The crisis of imperialism is going to shake all of these countries to their absolute core in the next few years. And it is absolutely vital that we keep our heads and keep up our tasks of rebuilding communist parties in all of the centers of imperialism. It's now become obvious to everybody that the so-called labor movements in all of these places, I think it's fair to say, but particularly Britain and the United States, the official labor movement is a dead zone, an absolute dead zone. It's led by some of the worst hacks you could possibly imagine. Whilst there is activity at the base level, like to expect that as a movement to do anything is completely erroneous. What communists should be doing, and we are doing this to at a starter level in the Great English Northwest, is trying to build ourselves what you might call small red bases in particular working class areas, trying to bring in to our organizations people who are sympathetic and open to the messages of and to learning Marxism, Leninism, and to start to build our red bases that way. And this is going to be a process which might take a few years. Who knows? The implosions to come might speed it up a little bit, but we are at the beginning of a process. I think speaking personally, it took like the complete disgrace of social democracy in the form of the implosion of and the visible cowardice of the Corbyn movement to finally like rip the blindfold off me, because having grown up as a sort of rather ultra-leftist Trotskyite and then easily pivoting into reformism with Corbyn, with all the justifications I gave to myself then, it took going through that process and seeing it from the inside destroy itself, being capable of mobilizing the proletariat, being capable of challenging the British ruling class. It took that to finally convince me that another path was needed, and the other path, of course, is the path to Marxist-Leninism. And this is the path that many of us in this chat are on now. So, okay, we will now greet some more people in the chat. Hello to Mike Martinez, who says, greetings from the land of Tom Cotton. My God, that's unfortunate, Mike. Marco enjoyed the historical overview. Good. Where Marius has noticed people online saying World War III is imminent since 2013 at least. Yep. Hello to you, Wan. Naila says, love to Ansar Allah. Yuan says, candidate dates for World War III is like history, is not binary but more fluid motion, no discontinuity. Yep. Anomalous asks a question. Was Marx totally against state socialism such as Bismarck's Germany, or did he criticize it in the same way he criticized classical political economy? Comes back to Putin and Bonapartism. Well, he criticized Ferdinand Lassalle, who thought that socialism was a project that could be reached via a collaboration between the proletariat and Bismarck. And the reason why he criticized that was he made the point that Bismarck's so-called state socialism, his nationalization of the railways, the post office, etc., that was fully within the scope of German capitalism at the time. And the idea that you were going to be able to negotiate your way to socialism with the Junkers and with the German capitalist class, Marx pointed out that that was foolish to Lassalle. But ultimately, Lassalle's views received a sort of reflection in the later work of people like Bernstein and ultimately Kautsky. The belief that you can find a section of the ruling class to negotiate with, and you're going to be able to negotiate with your way to socialism with them, that's been proven wrong time and time again. Like, no matter how it happens, I'm not going to sort of try and prescribe how any revolutionary process is going to look. But the capitalist class will have to be removed from power, and the capitalist state will have to be destroyed, and a proletarian state built in its place. Now, again, I'm not going to sit here and say it will happen like this, A, B, and C. There might be different forms of that process in terms of how that particular goal, those goals are reached, but those are goals that must be reached, and you can't avoid them. Look at the amount of times people have tried to avoid them. And that essentially goes back to the argument that Marx and Engels were having with Ferdinand Lassalle, that Lassalle's attempt to build some alliance with the Prussian Junkers was at best naive, at worst ruinous. As for state ownership and developmentalist economics that maybe Anomalous is referring to there, it is something which has emerged time and time again throughout the 20th century, especially in countries that are looking to develop their economies against the depredations of imperialism. None of them are necessarily socialist. Some of them could go in a socialist direction in the future. But again, developmentalism is not the same as socialism. Okay, so good evening to Jenny and Muzzle Paint. And Anomalous, before I read more Marx, says Anomalous, I have the goal of understanding Descartes, Kant, Hume, and then Hegel. I'll read volume 4, then 1 to 3 of Capital, the order Marx wrote it in. Well, sounds like you've got an impressive reading list there. I have a greater understanding of Hegel now than I did when I first read it. Descartes I need to revisit, and also Spinoza. I mean, I also need to revisit the Greeks, given the enormous influence that they had on Marx. And Kant, Hume I've not read in 22 years, so that probably needs revisiting as well. So, yeah, that will need to be something that is a rather long-term project, but Anomalous's comment does stir something in my own mind, which is that the job of a revolutionary is never done in terms of a revolutionary reading list. It is permanent and ever expanding. And also, once you've read something like I read Hume 20 years ago, 22 years ago, I'll probably be reading Hume with completely different eyes now. So, good job that you mentioned all of that. Beju says, Corbyn also made me realise the true nature of the Labour Party and that the time for social democracy is in the past. Good call. Nyla says, am I to assume nobody here is going to sign up to Boris Johnson's Cannon Fodder Club? Well, I will when Boris does. I mean, that's the deal I'm going to make with him. If Boris and Tobias Ellwood and David Lammy and Keir Starmer and throw in the Green Party, all of them, throw in most of the Tory backbenches, Ian Duncan Smith, various others. Once all of those clowns have signed up to be trench fodder in Ukraine or in Israel, they can go and fight in the IDF if they want. If Boris is really keen on this, he can go and try and take on the Al-Qassam brigades or the PFLP in Gaza, if he's keen on that. I mean, they're all keen on the war. Why not? Boris, Tobias Ellwood, Keir Starmer, David Lammy, the rest of the clowns in Parliament, let them go. Let them go and try and take on the Al-Qassam and the various other members of the National Liberation Forces in Gaza, or they can go down to Yemen. I mean, I'm sure that Boris Johnson charging off a landing ship on the coast of Yemen would be taken incredibly seriously by Ansarullah once they'd stop laughing. So, yeah, my deal is I'll go when they go. And seeing as they'll never go, I guess I'll never have to go. Spinoza is vital. Yes, I'm told. So I'm told. I only appreciated just how vital Hegel was when I followed Lenin's advice. Lenin said that it was impossible to fully understand Marx without having read and understood Hegel's logic. And I finally got around to reading it, and I was like, oh, yes, I can see exactly what he means, because everything in Marx's system, or perhaps not everything, an awful lot of what Marx's system of thought and the way Marx constructs it is reflected from and contained within in kernels within Hegel. And also it helps you understand things like Clausewitz. Like I read the first chapter of Clausewitz's On War recently, and you read that and it's clear that he is heavily influenced by Hegel's thought. Very much, so it's an incredibly dialectical work, Clausewitz's On War. I mean, the man was a real genius, it turns out. And again, you have to read that to understand the Russian special military operation. Anomalous says, a tall reading list indeed. I have read the manifesto and many quotes, which is the kind of vulnerable Marxism Stalin was wary of. I'm going to work on learning more to understand Marx better, which is exactly the right attitude. Like the unending reading list is compulsory for all of us. And what Anomalous is referring to there is, of course, that Stalin, and Molotov said this too, was very aware of the fact that the leaders of the party had stopped reading Marx and Lenin and Engels and other great thinkers, and were just reading pamphlets produced by the party, and then like the generation that came after them stopped reading even that. I mean, I think it was Georgi in the Telegram chat who posted up a conversation between Ceausescu and Gorbachev recently. Now, Ceausescu, what you might call a problematic figure, to say the least, but the allegations against him of like corruption and feathering his own nest, I don't think were true. I think whatever else he was, and there's a lot to criticize there, I don't think he was a corrupt man, and I don't think he regarded himself still to his end as a sincere communist. And so he was discussing with Gorbachev in 1989, and it's alleged that by some, including Ludo Martins, that Gorbachev played a key role in helping to orchestrate some of these coups in Eastern Europe. Off the top of his head, Ceausescu recalls this very obscure quote of Lenin's from like 1903, which I've never heard of. And he says to Gorbachev, I'm sure you'll recall what Lenin said in 1903 about this. And Gorbachev says, no. And then Ceausescu just recites it. Because, of course, Ceausescu was a revolutionary in Romania at a time when it was very risky to be a revolutionary in Romania. You know, growing up under the time of the nominally the monarchy, but under King Carol, but with a dictatorship essentially run by the fascist Ion Antonescu, the ally of Hitler. Ceausescu was in a concentration camp for a while and spent his formative years in there essentially learning Marxism from some of the older communist cadre that was stuck in there with him. So, yeah, whatever mistakes Ceausescu made, and again, I will emphasize there were plenty, he remained a convinced communist to the day that he died. And he died courageously whistling the Internationale as he faced a firing squad. So, but then again, like, you can see the difference. Like, Ceausescu is not only an older man, but a guy who had learnt everything by heart. He'd been brought up that way. Gorbachev, some sleazy, quite frankly, rather stupid man who'd been brought up on a book of Lenin quotes and had never read any of the originals. So, and to bear in mind something that both Lenin and Stalin says. Lenin says this in One Step Forward, Two Steps Back, and Stalin says it on multiple occasions. The leaders need to be the ones who are working the hardest, you know, the last to eat and the first to die, so to speak, but also the ones who are working hard to continually expand their knowledge and, you know, the system of Marxist-Leninism principally, but also all the other things that led into it, to understand the development of all the philosophy and the political economy that went into it. It's an onerous task, and that's why it's not ending, you know. But it's good that we realize that, and that we can now understand just how the decay, or one of the reasons that the decay set in the USSR, is also why Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership apparently reintroduced study sessions at the Politburo level over 10 years ago now. And if you read Xi Jinping's collected works, and I've just got the 4th volume of them now, you can see a similar obsession in certainly a lot of the stuff that he says and writes about party development, about the need for self-sacrifice, about the need for constant study. It's very much clearly influenced by, you can see he's read and actually understood what is to be done, and one step forward, two steps back, in a way that none of the later Soviet leaders did. Not Khrushchev, not Brezhnev, not Gorbachev. Of course, again, to repeat what we said earlier, Chinese Revolution, it's still too soon to tell how it'll turn out, but the signs at the moment are much more positive than they were 10 years ago. Right, Martin says, I'm finishing up Capital Volume 1, then Volume 2 and 3, then Grundrisse, then Hegel, then back to Marx and Engels' works on philosophy and dialectics. This is turning into a reading list show, and it's entirely right that it is. Yu Wan says, any Soviet leanings Putin might have is tempered by his balancing act with Russia's oligarchy. Yeah, it's a constant. You can see it in everything that he does and says. He's constantly having to balance the various different groups in his circle, the circle of powerful political actors that he partly came into power with, but I think it's changed over time. Though, again, the fact that he's pushed more and more down the route of being positive towards the Soviet legacy, and also the departure of many of those people he inherited from the Yeltsin period, like the flight of Anatoly Chubais to Israel, and the fact that so many of the most sort of out there compradors fled to the West, then promptly got their assets confiscated by the West, and now finally the measures that were pushed for by the KPRF apparently for so long, of the confiscation of assets of those oligarchs who have fled overseas and who have been shown to be acting as agents of imperialism, that law's now gone through the Duma, finally. It took like 2 years to do it, but they finally got there. So Putin continues to be pushed over the Rubicon, willingly or otherwise. Right. Roman Schaefer says, what do you think about the concept of labor aristocracy? How can you organize when workers in the imperial core partly profit from exploitation through imperialism? Well, Roman, we've talked about this considerably on past streams. So what I'm going to do, given the time we're on, is I'm going to give you a short answer now with the promise to return to it in the future. In short, the theory of the labor aristocracy posits, as it was originally set down by Lenin, posits that it is the upper end and leadership of the workers' movement in a place like Britain or the United States that directly benefits from the profits of imperialism, from the super profits of imperialism. And unfortunately, it was this layer in 1914 that was the dominant one in the German social democracy, in the British social democracy, and the French social democracy. It was the skilled craftsmen who were the first in this country to organize. They were the ones with the longest lasting, enduring craft trade union tradition. Many of them were much better paid than the overwhelming majority of the British working class, who remained very, very poor and often in a state of very poor health and with very low life expectancy. These upper-end workers, the skilled working class, the minority of the working class, they were the ones directly profiting from imperialism in various different ways. The same is true in all the imperialist countries. So it's not the entire working class that is the problem. It is the fact that a minority who happen to be some of the longest organized, longest and best organized sections, and are invariably in the leadership of the pre-existing labor movement, they are the ones who have the pro-imperialist tendencies, because they're the ones who are most closely linked to the imperialist system and the ones who benefit the most. It's not the overwhelming majority of the working class. So the problem is you have to push the labor aristocracy, the minority of the working class, out of the way and establish a new leadership of the working class drawn from the great majority, who do not benefit anything like as much or at all from the proceeds of imperialism. So that's my short answer, that the labor aristocracy is a minority that can be moved out of the way. Again, not without difficulties, and it's those difficulties that we're facing now. The other thing is to say that, of course, the labor aristocracy itself is diminishing. Like 30 years ago, you would never have seen hospital doctors on strike in Britain, because they were solid members of the labor aristocracy. But they are, of course, now on strike. Same with people like lawyers, like absolutely solid members of the aristocracy of labor. Many of them were very well rewarded. Of course, they're still paid by the hour. They still have only their intellectual labor to sell, but they were very much part of the aristocracy of labor. Some of the higher end of them were, of course, within the petty bourgeoisie. But even they now are facing de-skilling and ruin. So again, like what existed even 30 years ago in terms of a labor aristocracy is being relentlessly ruined now. Corbyn was really the left of the labor aristocracy's rebellion, and it's important to realize that. But I will return to this subject in the future for a more detailed analysis if, Roman, you are happy for me to return to it, having given you that brief answer. Battle Cossack says, Zyuganov is seen as a boomer by most Russians. Well, maybe. But fact is that, I've made criticisms of the KPRF in the past. And I mean, there are criticisms to be made there. But for all my criticisms of Zyuganov and the KPRF leaders, they've kept that party going for 30 years as the official opposition. They've kept a lot of the traditions, the better traditions, alive. And yes, the party will need to evolve and change if Russia is to go back to being definitively on the socialist path again. But I think they deserve credit for keeping a lot of things alive that would have died otherwise. So, yeah, there's criticisms to be made, but there's also credit to be given where it is due. And, I see Zyuganov again. Zyuganov's a Brezhnev-era official, with some of the strengths and some of the weaknesses that implies. But I do respect what the man's done in terms of the fact that he is an unapologetic advocate for the legacy of the Stalin period. And so if some Russians see him as some sort of embarrassing boomer, well, that doesn't really concern me. Those who judge him like that should make a more proper analysis and should educate themselves more, to be frank, and learn how to make better criticisms. Frank says, please talk about the book Power of Ideology by Istvan Meszaros. Well, I will when I've read it. That's the deal I'll make with you there, Frank. Battle Cossack says, I've seen a policeman in Argentina wearing a garden flag patch, the Libertarians flag, like a Ukrainian soldier wearing a Nazi patch. Well, I'm not surprised, given the cultures that exist in the forces of the state. But again, like as we were saying last night, I mean, Argentina, that fucking comprador swine, Milei and Mauricio Macri, who stands behind him, these people, with all the sort of wild bullshit they engage in, it's a simple thing that they're doing, and they're selling Argentina by the pound to the U.S. imperialists, just as President Maduro correctly said in a video he did recently. So, like, these fucking idiots wearing like these libertarian patches or fascist patches, these fake tough guys, well, congratulations to them. They may get to crush people's heads with a nightstick or shoot people, but all they're really doing is condemning the nation to slavery. They might make a buck out of it on the way, but these people are just traitors, quite frankly, and I think we should be prepared to use that language about them. Dan Kavalik's enjoying the show. Well, good to see you here, Dan. U.S. imperialists don't need a labor aristocracy anymore. I don't think it's that they don't need it, Jenny. I think it's that the crisis of the system is such that they are obliged to attack even people and layers that were necessary for them in previous eras in maintaining the stability of their system. The crisis is so deep that they're now having to withdraw all the concessions that previously guaranteed stability. Look at this farmers' protest in Germany or France or the Netherlands or Poland or Romania, but particularly in the imperialist countries. They, through the subsidies system that was managed by the European Union, kept the petty bourgeois landowners, the small and medium farmers, in business for far longer than in places like Britain. And those layers in the 60s and 70s and even into the 80s acted as stabilizing factors for the rule of the bourgeoisie in France and Germany and the other big European imperialist powers. This starts to disintegrate in the 90s, especially in France, when the subsidies start being retracted. And now, given the crisis that Europe is in, European capitalist classes are in, they're obliged now to attack the elements within the social structure, like the petty bourgeois landowners, who used to be pillars of the system. So this isn't a case of them not needing them anymore. It's a case of the fact that the capitalist class, if it wants to maintain its position, has to go on the attack in a way that they've not in many, many years, and has to withdraw all the concessions, even made to those who used to be solid allies of the capitalist class in the form of certain elements in the petty bourgeoisie and upper-end working class. I think that is the way that I would analyze the situation. Frank says that I thought super imperialism clarified many things. Please, more of your criticism. Right. Okay. Well, we'll do a more thorough analysis of Hudson's work in the near future then, when I get time to get back to it. Anomalous says boomers in Russia like Soviet-style communism. Well, on that, the Russian boomers are more correct than most, I would say. Bear in mind that the overwhelming majority of Russians and Ukrainians, as I will never tire of saying, voted to retain the Soviet system, even in the diminished form that it was in 1991, and that the biggest demonstrations that ever took place against the government in Russia in the Soviet period were against Gorbachev and his attempts to destroy that system. Always bear that in mind. Millet is the king of clowns. Well, he's a clown, but he's a dangerous clown. He's a clown that seeks to, ultimately he will seek to bring in a new form of fascism into Argentina in order that he can use the full power of the state to brutalize the Argentine working class into submission. I don't think he'll succeed. I think that the Argentine working class will prove too strong for him, but I realize that's based on hope rather than firm knowledge at the moment, so don't take that as a prescription. I will have to research the situation a lot more before I can make a more confident analysis of that. Right, okay, we are heading towards 10 to midnight here in Britain. Tomorrow, I have coming up at 2 p.m. British time, an interview with Kit Clarenberg. It's going to be in the form of a live stream, so please return for that. That will be an excellent discussion of the International Court of Justice case between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. Turns out it's been running since 2017 over the allegations that the Ukrainian government, backed up by a phalanx of lawyers provided by law firms from Britain and the USA, that the Russians were basically financing terrorism. I think the case that they made was. And I've only skimmed the verdicts from the ICJ, but what's basically happened is that the ICJ has rejected the arguments made by the Ukrainian government in that case. So I will be talking to Kit Clarenberg tomorrow about that and probably a lot of other issues as well. Join me for that. And then we'll be back again with a live stream on Friday. And then we will be doing a patron show again on Saturday. So we'll have that lined up as well. This will be it's the edited version of this program will be on the Patreon page from tomorrow morning. And we will, of course, be advertising our future live streams across our various different platforms. If you haven't joined the Telegram group yet, then be sure to do so. Other than that, thank you to everybody who's joined the chat tonight. It's been a very interesting discussion, as always. And thanks to all those who've posed questions. If I've not got to your question tonight, I see Anomalous has posed another one. I'll make a note of it and get to it on the next live stream where I'm answering questions. So thanks to everybody who's tuned in tonight. See you again tomorrow. I'll throw you back over now to the musical interlude.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come all you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kick them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea.